Hey there friends, I hope you're doing well and getting some paint on your minis. This is Frosthaven, the highly anticipated co-op dungeon delving sequel to Gloomhaven. It earned nearly $13 million on Kickstarter and became one of the most quickly funded Kickstarter campaigns of all time. It is massive and it is weighty, an absolute monster among my collection of board games. It is easily the largest game I own, and I own many games. Frosthaven takes place in the frozen wastelands of the north, where players take on the role of adventurers, seeking to uncover the secrets there and protect it from the dangers within. My wife and I played a ton of Gloomhaven throughout the pandemic. It took over our dining room table for an extended period of time. So when we heard that Frosthaven was coming out, we jumped at the opportunity to order ourselves a copy. I actually strong-armed my wife into painting her first miniature because of Gloomhaven, although at that time, the situation wasn't really the best. We lived in a place where we didn't have a dedicated painting area. The lighting was kinda not so great, and honestly, the miniatures weren't the best to start with. They weren't perfect. But the game was amazing. We got paint on our miniatures, and we journeyed into the dark. So is Frosthaven a better game? And how are the miniatures? Let's find out. My wife and I hastily unboxed the game, just digging through it, trying to get to the gribblies at the bottom. We wanted to choose our characters for our upcoming campaign. We were unbelievably excited. Despite our haste, it took some time. This box is massive. I actually weighed the box ahead of time, and it weighed 33 pounds. That's nuts. I always thought Gloomhaven was such a massive game. This game is on a whole other level. It is massive. One of the biggest changes with Frosthaven is that it's far more streamlined than Gloomhaven, making it faster and more intuitive, while still retaining the tactical depth that made Gloomhaven so popular. However, many more options were also added to the game: crafting, questline trees, base building, more cards than ever, more monsters, more items, etc. So while the game is streamlined, it's even bigger due to the increased amount of options available to players. When we finally got down to the bottom of the box, we found what we were looking for. Tiny little boxes that contained the miniatures for the game. We ripped right into the boxes for the 6 starting classes, which actually results into 7 miniatures. The rest of these boxes are to stay sealed until we unlock them during the campaign. How enticing. Seeing the miniatures available to you from the start, we were beyond excited. They are much more interesting than the starting characters from Gloomhaven, and there's a lot of female representation here too. Really cool. Frosthaven's miniatures were touted in interviews with the designers as being a step up from Gloomhaven's. Single mold casting was the approach with the first game, whereas here some of the models were cast in 2 molds and then assembled at the factory in order to provide for some more dynamic and interesting poses that would be harder to achieve with a single mold. However, once we got the miniatures under a decent light, I was a little less excited. They're covered in mold lines, there's some light flashing, which is pieces of plastic that aren't supposed to be there. Some of the minis were a little bent, but that's fine. Some hot water will fix that. The biggest offenders were actually the bases. They had mold lines running all over them, extra pieces of plastic showing up. The worst one was the Blink Blade class, which has these little hexagons on the base, but with the way it was cast, some of these hexagons were like different heights. There's just very obvious seam lines running down them, which required some heavy lifting with a knife to fix. Despite these issues though, overall I do like the miniatures. They're fairly interesting to look at. There's a lot of dynamic looking miniatures. They're definitely a step up from the ones that come with Gloomhaven. They all also have these stamps on the bottom that show their class icon, which is a nice little thing to kind of mix in. Overall though, they're very different than the typical fantasy tropes that you see in these kinds of games. There's even this character here who comes with 2 models to switch between different modes of attack. One is built for ranged attacks and one is built for melee. A little more advanced than I would like. I'm not quite prepared for it, but I will try it in the future. So I took out my tools and got to work. I grabbed my hobby knife, some sanding pads, some sanding sticks, and I just went hard on these best I could. But the plastic that they're made out of is so rubbery that it really made it difficult to do. Eventually I just got to this point where it felt like I was doing more damage to the models than actually fixing them. There was these little crevices that were just almost impossible to get to, and I'm cutting away at the plastic and it's just like slicing through everything. Sanding them down didn't really work. It just kind of like scuffed up the area. So eventually I just kind of laid down and just said, I'm done. This is gonna have to be good enough. So now with the models all cleaned up, let's come in with a black primer and get these ready to paint. As you may know by now, when I finish with a black prime, I like to come back in with a light gray from the top and just apply a zenithal effect, just to make the models a little easier to see. It really makes the painting experience a lot better. After the zenithal prime was applied, the mold lines became even more evident, but it also picked out some of the details, making them look nicer overall. They aren't perfect, but they are definitely interesting characters to look at. My wife and I decided to play the Banner Spear and Drifter classes to kick off our campaign, so it's time to get some paint on those models. This guy here is a Drifter, one of the Inox, a proud and stubborn race of massive bestial beings. Their tribes were decimated by humans as they expanded across the continent, leaving only a few settlements scattered throughout the nooks and crannies of the world. Some of them continue to fight back against human expansion, while others have taken the easier path of joining human societies and taking advantage of the comforts that they offer. The Drifters are those that have thrown aside allegiances with the Inox and humans, traveling the world looking out for themselves, surviving day to day off the land, testing their skills against the tapestry of a harsh and brutal landscape. Painting this model was both fun and a total pain. The miniature has a pose that is mostly a bit static, but it's a unique looking character design overall. However, the horns on his head had multiple mold lines that I had a really hard time trying to remove and ended up giving up on, which shows in the paint job. Also, a lot of the details that I know are supposed to be there are so faint that even after a very light prime job, they all but disappeared. For example, the stitching on his legs, which I believe are supposed to be some kind of leather. Even some of the larger details just kind of meld together, making it hard to properly pick them out. The bags on his belt, for example, they just kind of look like blobs without some extra work. He has a toothy grin, which mostly fades away and requires some work to pick out. Also, the club he's holding is a total mold line nightmare. Every spike on the club has a mold line around it that was basically impossible to cleanly remove. But I did my best, and I think he turned out pretty well. Then we have the Banner Spear. She's a human. A race of people ever met with tragedy and war, persevering through the ages to become the most prolific of civilizations. They attempted to conquer the north, Frosthaven, and found it to be more challenging than expected, encountering deadly beasts, environmental hazards, and even deadlier things hiding in the dark. The Banner Spears are tireless warriors forever in search of glory and honor at the behest of the capital city of White Oak. Cut off from the order they hold dear and faced with the harsh realities of the north, Banner Spears are forced to reevaluate what matters most. Will they give up everything to protect the outposts of Frosthaven, or flee from the face of chaos and destruction? Another very cool character, and another frustrating one to paint. The sculpt is actually much better than the Drifter mini, which is a little surprising because it's much more dynamic. However, the details really bleed into each other a lot. The fur on her back runs into the javelins that are strapped to her, along with the rope that's holding them together, making a messy blob to work through while painting. The sheath for her sword is far chunkier than it should be. The bottom of it is so thick that you could fit an entire armory in there. Also, her right hand is a fist, but because of the angle it's at, it seems that the mold didn't capture all the detail properly, so it makes it look like there's just a blob at the end of her wrist rather than a hand. However, all in all, it's a fairly good sculpt despite the mold lines. So what do I actually think about the miniatures that come with Frosthaven? Well, one, they're far better than the ones that come with Gloomhaven. There's more detail there, there's more interesting poses, and the character designs are just far more interesting. So despite the mold line issues, the flashing, the bendy swords, they're actually pretty fun to paint. I had a great time. Just because the characters are so interesting, I was able to kind of forego worrying about those issues, and just had a good time getting through them. So I actually highly recommend picking up Frosthaven despite the miniatures. My wife and I have played a couple quests so far, and it has been a total blast. And if Gloomhaven says anything, we're going to have an amazing time working through this campaign. Pick up Frosthaven if you want to have a good time with some friends, if you want to stab some monsters in the dark, get some cool loot, level up, try out some fun abilities, and just get immersed in some other world. So thanks again for watching my video. I hope you enjoyed it. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button, like, comment, all that stuff. It really helps out a lot, and I super appreciate it. So until next time, have a great one, and paint today for a better tomorrow. Thanks. Bye.